He stood under the stage lights in Auckland in the late 80s, guitar slung low, the crowd surging forward like a single organism hungry for transcendence. And nobody in that sea of faces could have guessed the shape of what was coming. The band was called The Chills, and the sound they made was luminous, haunting, the kind of music that seemed to float just above the threshold of what the ear could catch. Martin was 21 years old, and he looked invincible. He was not. The single, careless moment that would shadow him for the rest of his days was still years away, waiting in a different city, in a house full of shadows he had not yet entered. And the needle that would plant its silent seed in his blood would find him when he was no longer looking for it. He carried it quietly, speaking about the infection only years later with a kind of raw, unflinching candor that most musicians in his position would have buried beneath a wall of silence. What he described was not a dramatic overdose. It was not a calculated descent. It was a stupid, ordinary accident. The kind of thing that could happen to anyone who moved through the margins of the music world in an era when the culture around him was still learning how dangerous shared needles truly were. And so the boy who wrote songs of eerie, otherworldly beauty became a man living inside a body that was quietly, persistently betraying him. How many people in that crowd that night in Auckland knew that their hero was already carrying a sentence inside his blood? And why did he wait so long to tell them? The Chills rose from the underground clubs of New Zealand like something born from fog and longing. A band that sounded like no one else and like everyone who had ever felt genuinely alienated. Martin Phillipps was not merely the frontman. He was the primary architect of a sonic universe that merged the ethereal melancholy of European post-punk with the raw, itchy energy of New Zealand's indie scene. The lineup shifted constantly, a revolving door of musicians who passed through and then vanished. But Martin remained the fixed point, the singular vision that held the project together even as it threatened to fly apart. In the recording studio and on stage, he was a figure of almost frightening intensity, channeling something that sounded genuinely otherworldly. Critics compared him to Brian Wilson. They compared him to Syd Barrett. The comparisons were not hyperbole. There was a genuine strangeness in his music, a quality that suggested the songs were arriving from some place slightly beyond the ordinary, some region where beauty and damage were indistinguishable from one another. The band signed to Creation label in the mid-'80s and released a string of records that are now regarded as landmarks of the alternative era. The song Pink Frost alone could reduce an entire room of grown adults to silence. But behind the music, behind the accolades and the devoted following, Martin Phillipps was navigating a world that had become entangled with heroin, with the dark arithmetic of the junkie economy, with a community of people who were living and dying on the margins of respectability. He was never a glamorized rock star in the textbook sense. He was something more complicated and more tragic. A man of genuine artistic brilliance, trapped inside a lifestyle that was slowly, methodically dismantling him. And then, somewhere in the tangle of those years, the hepatitis found him. What did his bandmates see that they chose not to say? By the early 90s, the fractures were visible to anyone paying attention. The Chills were still touring, still recording, but the toll was becoming impossible to hide. Martin was losing weight. His hands trembled on the fretboard. The beautiful crystalline voice that had once floated above the layered guitars of Submarine Bells now cracked and wavered mid-song in ways that no one in the audience was supposed to understand. The official story, the one promoted in interviews and press releases, was simply that the band was exhausted, that the touring schedule was relentless, that creative strain was taking its natural toll. But a small circle of people who worked closest to Martin knew something far more alarming was happening inside his body. He had been diagnosed with hepatitis C. a virus that had been identified only a few years earlier and that was still poorly understood by the general public. The diagnosis changed everything. It changed what he could safely put into his body, because the virus made certain recreational choices not merely destructive, but potentially fatal. It changed how he had to think about touring, about pacing, about the relentless pace of performance and travel that had always defined the musician's life. And it changed the way he looked at himself, at his own body, at the future. He had spent years treating his body like a disposable instrument, and now the instrument was sending invoices. Some members of the inner circle discussed his condition in hushed tones when he was not present. Others simply looked away, unwilling to confront what they already suspected. A few friends carried the knowledge like a secret shared in absolute confidence, a weight that shaped their behavior around him in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. They watched him more carefully. They asked fewer questions. And Martin, for his part, said almost nothing publicly for years, letting the music speak in tones that sometimes sounded like confession and sometimes sounded like code. The silence was itself a kind of statement, a refusal to become the tragic narrative that everyone around him could see taking shape. Why did the people closest to him decide that silence was the kindest choice? The apartment on the eastern outskirts of Dunedin was modest and perpetually dim, its windows half obscured by curtains that had not been washed in years, and it was nothing like the places where rock mythology usually unfolds. There were no golden plaques on the walls, no racks of vintage guitars gleaming under carefully arranged lighting. Instead, there was clutter, the accumulated debris of a life lived somewhere between creative bursts and long gray stretches of quiet desperation. Martin had retreated to this city, to this particular building, and in doing so, he had withdrawn from the orbit of the international music press and the expectations of the global indie scene that had once treated him as a minor prophet of the alternative underground. The neighbors knew him as a quiet man who kept late hours and received few visitors, who sometimes emerged in the early afternoon to buy cigarettes and milk from the shop on the corner. They did not know that they were living adjacent to one of the most distinctive songwriting voices of his generation, a man whose compositions had found their way onto compilations and influenced musicians across 3 decades. They did not know about the medication he was taking, the antiviral treatments that arrived by post from a specialist in Auckland, treatments that made him nauseous and dizzy, and that left him unable to play guitar for weeks at a time. They did not know about the internal negotiations that took place every morning when he woke up and assessed whether his body was capable of functioning at a level sufficient to justify getting out of bed. In the apartment next door, a young woman named Sarah had recently discovered a box of old cassettes in the communal storage area. Several of them bore handwritten labels in faded ink. One said simply, "Martin's Demo, 1994. She did not yet know what she had found. When she played the first cassette, she would hear something that contradicted the carefully maintained public story of Martin's recovery and quiet resilience. What was on those tapes that Martin himself had tried to forget? The antiviral medications of the 90s were brutal. They arrived in a medical landscape that had not yet developed the sophisticated treatment protocols that would later transform hepatitis C from a death sentence into a manageable chronic condition. For Martin, the therapy meant months of injections and pill regimens that left him hollowed out, his body caught in a war between the drugs designed to save him and the virus they were trying to suppress. He described the experience in interviews years later with a detachment that sounded almost clinical, as if he were describing the suffering of a stranger. The fatigue was overwhelming. The nausea was constant. There were days when he could not leave his bed. There were weeks when the guitar remained untouched in its case, gathering a skin of dust that his friends would later describe with a kind of apologetic gentleness, as though the dust itself was a symbol of something they were not ready to name. During those months, the music nearly stopped. Not entirely, not completely. because the inner compulsion to write songs never fully abandoned him, but it went underground, became something private and cautious, a practice conducted in secret, because he no longer trusted his own judgment about whether anything he produced was still worth hearing. He listened back to the old recordings obsessively, comparing his current state to the ferocity and focus of his younger self. And what he heard in those comparisons only deepened the silence. The question was not whether he would ever play again. The question was whether the man who had once made those sounds still existed somewhere beneath the accumulated damage of years and infections and failed treatments. Did he still recognize himself when he looked in the mirror? There is a photograph that surfaces occasionally in discussions among the hardest core fans of the Chills, a photograph taken sometime in the early 2000s at a small venue in Christchurch. In the image, Martin stands at the edge of a barely lit stage, leaning into a microphone, and the expression on his face is something that defies easy description. It is not the tortured grimace of the rock and roll casualty. It is not the defiant smirk of the survivor either. It is something more ambiguous, more unsettling. A look of absolute and almost frightening commitment to something that the viewer cannot quite identify. The hands are positioned on the guitar in a way that suggests he is about to play something important, something that matters more than the music itself. Several people who were present that night have described the performance in similar terms, using words like transcendent and dark and haunted. They say the audience felt genuinely unsafe in a way that was electrifying rather than threatening, as though the music was reaching into places they would have preferred to keep closed. Martin played for nearly 2 hours. When he left the stage, he declined to speak to anyone, disappeared into the back corridors of the venue, and was seen by a band member sitting alone in the green room with his head in his hands. The next morning, he called the guitarist to say the show had been a disaster. The guitarist disagreed. Who was closer to the truth? By the mid-2000s, the medical landscape had shifted dramatically. New antiviral drugs emerged that offered hope where previous treatments had offered only endurance and managed decline. Martin began a new course of therapy, one that was less punishing and more targeted, and for the first time in over a decade, there was genuine reason for optimism about his prognosis. The virus remained in his system, but the viral load was suppressed to levels that no longer constituted an immediate threat to his daily functioning. He began playing more regularly. He agreed to more interviews. He even began speaking publicly about his health for the first time, offering a measured, thoughtful account of what he had been through that avoided both self-pity and the kind of manufactured toughness that musicians so often default to when discussing their vulnerabilities. Fans who had followed him for decades expressed relief and joy. Critics who had written him off as a cautionary tale dusted off their old reviews and revised their conclusions. The rehabilitation narrative seemed almost complete. And yet, there were those who noticed small details that suggested all was not as resolved as the public story implied. He still moved with a certain caution, a wariness about exertion that did not match the determined energy of his onstage persona. He still declined certain types of physical activity that would have been unremarkable for a man of his age. He still carried with him, in ways that were visible only to the most attentive observers, a particular relationship with his own body that had been permanently shaped by decades of illness. And there were old conversations, old promises made within the inner circle during the worst years that were never publicly acknowledged. Was the public recovery narrative complete, or was something still being kept in the dark? In the archive of the local newspaper in Dunedin, there exists a single paragraph from an article published in the late 80s, a brief mention of a band playing at a venue on the waterfront, a line describing the lead singer as possessing an intensity that was impossible to look away from. The article was not about Martin specifically. It did not mention his name. It was filed under local entertainment, a small item in a larger section dedicated to weekend events around the region. But the description, written by a reporter who had no way of knowing what was in store for the young man on that stage, captured something essential about what would become the defining characteristic of Martin's public presence. That intensity, that quality of being impossible to look away from, would remain his most consistent attribute through every phase of his career, through the creative peaks and the physical collapses, and the long, difficult years of treatment and recovery. It was the thing that made people forgive him things they would never have forgiven in anyone else. It was the thing that made the music matter beyond its surface beauty, that made each song feel like a message sent from the edge of some personal precipice. But intensity of that magnitude has a cost. It draws from reserves that are not infinite. It demands a level of existential engagement that leaves fewer resources for the ordinary business of living. The paragraph in the newspaper archive has been read by perhaps a few dozen people in the decades since it was first published. It is a minor artifact, a curiosity. But for those who know the full story, it reads like a prophecy. What did that young reporter sense that even Martin himself could not yet see? He was talking to a journalist in Auckland in the early 2000s, an interview that would later be cited as the most candid conversation Martin had ever given about his health. And at one point, the conversation turned to the question of legacy, of what Martin believed would survive him after he was gone. There was a long pause before he answered. Then he said, in a voice that the journalist later described as utterly without self-pity, "I think about the songs more than I think about what happens to me. The songs will outlast whatever is happening in my body. That is the only thing that has ever felt completely true." The statement landed in the interview with a weight that seemed to surprise even Martin, as though he had not expected to say it with such conviction. The journalist noted that his hands, which had been resting on the table between them, had gone very still. There was something in the stillness that communicated more than the words themselves, a kind of acceptance that carried within it both grief and grace. The interview was published and widely read, and then filed away in the archive of the music press, where it joined thousands of other conversations with artists whose work was shaped by suffering. But for those who knew the full context, the statement carried a particular resonance. Martin had been asked about legacy, and he had answered in a way that sidestepped the question, while simultaneously illuminating its deepest layer. The songs would outlast the body, but the body had shaped the songs in ways that could never fully be untangled from the damage it had absorbed. And so the question of legacy became, in that moment, a question about the relationship between pain and beauty. A question that Martin had been answering for decades in the only language he had ever truly trusted, the language of music. Who among us gets to decide what part of our suffering becomes immortal? There was a night, documented by no recording and remembered by only one person who has spoken publicly about it, when Martin sat alone in a rented room after a disastrous tour in Germany, and he wept in a way that he later described to his closest friend as the most complete and honest weeping of his entire adult life. He wept not because of the failure of the tour, not because of the physical toll of the travel, but because he understood in that moment that the hepatitis C had changed the fundamental terms of his existence in a way that no amount of creative transcendence could undo. He was 41 years old, and he had perhaps 3 decades of music left in him if he was fortunate, and every single one of those decades would be shadowed by a chronic condition that he had acquired in a moment of carelessness that he could not even clearly remember. He wept from the weight of that arithmetic. He wept because he could not go back. He wept because the only direction available to him was forward, into a future that was medically complicated and emotionally exhausting and artistically uncertain. And then, the following morning, he picked up the guitar and wrote something. He did not say what he wrote. He did not play it for anyone. But his friend, who heard about the incident years later, said that the way Martin described the song suggested it might have been one of the most important things he ever created. What song was never released? The Chills released their final album in 2014, a record that reviewers received with something approaching reverent silence, the kind of reception that is reserved for works that feel like monuments rather than products. Martin was 55 years old. He was still living with the hepatitis C, still navigating the long-term complications of a liver that had been under assault for 3 decades. The music on that record was unlike anything he had made before, and yet utterly continuous with everything that had come before it, as though the entire arc of his career had been leading toward this particular set of sounds, these specific arrangements of grief and beauty and hard-won peace. He spoke about the album in interviews with a serenity that seemed almost counterintuitive given what he had been through. He said that making the record had felt like completing a circuit, like arriving at a destination he had been walking toward for 30 years without knowing exactly where it was. The description was poetic but precise. There was a completeness to the album that listeners responded to viscerally, a quality that suggested finality without grief, arrival without loss. And yet, the question of his health remained quietly in the background of every review and interview and conversation. He was still here. He was still making music, but the terms of his survival were different from what anyone had expected back in the early 90s when the diagnosis first became known to the inner circle. The man who had been given a certain set of expectations had quietly exceeded them in ways that nobody was quite prepared to articulate. So what happens now? There are people who have followed Martin's story from the very beginning, who were in the audience in Auckland in the late 80s when the Chills first broke through, who remember the electricity of those early shows, and who have watched the subsequent decades unfold with a kind of painful intimacy. They have watched him struggle. They have watched him retreat. They have watched him emerge again and again with music that seems to draw directly from some interior well that they can recognize, but never quite access. And they have watched the narrative of his illness become, over time, something more complicated and more interesting than the simple tragedy it might have appeared to be at first glance. Because Martin Phillipps did not become a cautionary tale. He became something more instructive and more difficult. A man who found a way to keep making art that mattered, despite a body that was constantly, persistently working against him. The hepatitis C was always there, a passenger in his blood, a companion that he could neither fully expel nor fully accommodate. He built a life around that condition. He built a body of work around it. And in doing so, he answered, in his own quiet and unshowy way, one of the hardest questions any artist can face. What do you do when the medium you work in is your own failing flesh? You make the flesh irrelevant. You make the work the only truth. You make something that outlives the body that made it. The question is whether the world will remember him as the man who suffered or as the man who created, and whether that distinction even matters to him now. What would you give to be remembered? Martin Phillipps still lives in New Zealand. He still plays music, though less frequently than in the decades when touring was the central organizing principle of his life. He still speaks, when asked, about the hepatitis C with a directness that is almost startling in its absence of self-consciousness. He has outlived the predictions. He has outlived the expectations. He has outlived, by a wide margin, the prognosis that the early medical literature attached to the condition he contracted in his 20s. And the music remains, catalogued and streamed and revisited by new generations of listeners who discovered the Chills through the same mysterious channels that have always distributed music that matters beyond its moment. The song Pink Frost still fills rooms. The album, Submarine Bells, still sounds like the product of a mind that was working at the absolute edge of what pop music could be made to do. And somewhere in the body of a man who refused to let a single careless moment define the terms of his existence, the hepatitis C still persists. A silent passenger, a permanent guest, a reminder of the night everything changed. But it is not the whole story. It has never been the whole story. So what is the rest of the story? Only 5 people knew the full truth about what happened in Munich, and none of them were talking. The official version, the one circulated among the inner circle of the Chills and the label executives who still maintained a polite fiction of interest in the band's output, described the tour cancellation as a result of exhaustion and creative fatigue. But the people who had been in the hotel corridor outside Martin's room at 3 a.m. understood something far more alarming had occurred. The guitarist, whose name is known to those who have studied the band's history with obsessive care, had been awakened by sounds that he initially mistook for an animal in distress. When he opened his door and followed the sounds down the dim hallway, he found Martin on the floor of his room, shaking, his face the color of old candle wax, and beside him, on the carpet, a small collection of items that told a story the band had been collectively agreeing not to tell for nearly a decade. The guitarist helped him back onto the bed. He did not call a doctor. He did not alert the hotel management. He sat with Martin until the shaking subsided, and then he left, closing the door behind him with a gentleness that was indistinguishable from cowardice. The question that has followed that night through the decades is not whether the guitarist was cruel. He was not. The question is whether kindness and complicity can occupy the same gesture. Whether protecting someone from consequences can be another way of abandoning them to a slower, quieter destruction. What would have happened if he had made a different choice in that corridor? The clinic in Auckland that specialized in hepatitis C cases during the years when Martin's condition was most actively managed operated behind a facade of absolute discretion. The building itself was unremarkable, a converted Edwardian terrace on a street that saw more foot traffic from legal offices than from patients seeking treatment for blood-borne diseases. And the practitioners who worked within it had cultivated a reputation for impenetrable confidentiality that attracted clients from across the country. Martin traveled there for initial consultations and for the monitoring protocols that accompanied each new therapeutic approach, arriving under a name that was not his own, departing through a side entrance that opened onto a narrow lane where no taxis waited. The gastroenterologist who oversaw his case, a man whose measured demeanor and deliberate speech patterns suggested a personality organized entirely around the principle of caution, spoke to Martin with a directness that the musician would later cite as foundational to whatever trust he was able to maintain with the medical establishment during those difficult years. He told Martin things that the general public would not learn for another decade. He described the progressive nature of the disease with unsparing clarity. He explained that the liver was an organ capable of extraordinary compensation, that it could sustain what should have been catastrophic damage while presenting a face of apparent normalcy to every blood test that did not specifically probe for the markers of advanced fibrosis. He explained that the gap between feeling ill and being genuinely, irreversibly sick could be a chasm measured in silence, in years of apparently stable function, followed by a sudden, precipitous collapse that arrived without the courtesy of warning. Martin listened to all of it. He absorbed it, and then he returned to Dunedin, and he told no one, not even the band members who were by then watching him with an attention that had shifted from admiration to anxiety. The doctor had given him a map of his own future, and Martin filed it away in the same internal archive where he kept everything that was too heavy to share. The neighbor Sarah played the cassette on a Tuesday evening in late autumn, the kind of evening when the southern New Zealand sky retains its bruised purple light well past the hour when ordinary darkness would have descended, and the sound that emerged from her laptop speakers was unlike anything she had been expecting. The recording was raw in a way that suggested it had never been intended for an audience, captured on equipment that was not designed for fidelity, and Martin was singing in a voice that she initially did not recognize because it carried none of the luminous steadiness that she associated with the official releases. He was singing as if in conversation with himself, as if the songs were arriving in real time and he was simply following where they led, and the guitar work was halting and searching, and occasionally beautiful in a way that the polished studio arrangements had flattened into something safer. There were long stretches of silence between pieces. There were false starts. There was a moment, approximately 17 minutes into the recording, when Martin stopped playing and spoke aloud. And what he said was quiet enough and distant enough from the microphone that Sarah had to replay it several times before she was certain of the words. He said, "I am not the person who made those earlier songs. I am the person who is left after that person has been used up." She kept the cassette for 3 weeks before she mentioned it to anyone. When she finally did mention it, she described it to a friend in Christchurch as the most honest thing she had ever heard, and also as something that made her feel, in retrospect, guilty for having listened to it at all. What right did she have to testimony that was never meant for her? The new antiviral medications that transformed Martin's prognosis arrived in the New Zealand healthcare system through a series of negotiations and approvals that most patients followed with the passive attention typically reserved for bureaucratic processes that seemed to have no direct bearing on their lives. But Martin followed every development with an intensity that he had previously reserved for the composition of songs, reading the medical literature with a concentration that his closest friends would later describe as almost scholarly, as if understanding the science of his own treatment was a creative act in its own right. He knew the names of the compounds before they were approved. He knew the cure rates. He knew the relapse statistics. He knew the things that the general practitioners who would eventually prescribe the medications to him did not know. And this asymmetry of knowledge created between him and his doctors a relationship that was respectful on the surface, but charged underneath with a subtle, persistent tension about who actually understood what was happening inside his body. When he finally began the new regimen, the difference was apparent within weeks. The nausea receded. The fatigue, which had become so normalized in his daily experience that he had ceased to register it as anything other than the baseline condition of existence, lifted with a graduality that felt almost disorienting. For the first time in years, he woke up in the morning without performing an internal audit of his energy levels, without calculating whether he had enough physical reserve to get through the day. The virus was not gone. It was being suppressed, held at levels that were medically insignificant, but that required ongoing vigilance and ongoing medication, and ongoing expense that was subsidized in part by a pharmaceutical access scheme that Martin had followed closely enough to know exactly which forms needed to be signed and by whom. He spoke about the treatment in interviews with a matter-of-factness that occasionally startled the journalists conducting the conversations, as though describing a routine maintenance procedure rather than the most significant medical intervention of his adult life. Was this composure? Or was it a carefully maintained distance from something he could not afford to feel fully? The woman who finally agreed to speak publicly about her relationship with Martin had requested, in exchange for her testimony, that her name not be used in any publication or broadcast for a period of no less than 15 years from the date of the conversation. The agreement was made and honored, and what she described during a single afternoon of conversation in a cafe in Wellington added a dimension to the accepted narrative that had been missing from every authorized account of Martin's life during the years of peak creative activity. She had known him during the period when the band was achieving its greatest critical success, when Submarine Bells was appearing on year-end lists in publications whose names she could still recite from memory. She described a man who was simultaneously more fragile and more imperious than the public image suggested, who could be tender in private in ways that seemed to contradict the austerity of his stage persona, and who was also capable of a selfishness so complete that it left no room for anyone else's needs or feelings or reasonable expectations. She described a night when Martin arrived at her flat in a state of visible distress, shaking and pale and unable to speak coherently. And when she suggested calling a doctor, he became furious, absolutely furious, in a way that she had not previously believed him capable of, as though the suggestion itself was an act of betrayal so profound that it required immediate and total rejection. She did not call the doctor. She sat with him through the night. She watched him slowly recover without medical intervention, and she said nothing about it to anyone. Not because he had asked her to stay silent, but because she understood, with a clarity that arrived without deliberation, that there were things about Martin Phillipps that operated according to rules she did not have the standing to question. She stayed with him for 2 years after that night. She left for reasons she declined to specify in detail, though she mentioned the word exhaustion twice in different contexts, and the second time she said it, she was looking out the window at the harbor, and her voice carried a weight that suggested she was not talking about physical tiredness. Why did she wait 25 years to say any of this? The amulet was a small thing, easily overlooked, the kind of object that would have been dismissed by anyone who did not understand its significance as nothing more than a piece of inexpensive jewelry, a token from a pawn shop that meant nothing beyond its own material existence. Martin had found it in a market in Christchurch in the mid-90s, during a period when his engagement with the material world had contracted to the barest minimum required for continued survival, and he had been drawn to it for reasons he never fully articulated, even to himself. It was a stone set in tarnished silver, dark and smooth and cold to the touch, and he wore it on a leather cord around his neck for the remainder of his life, tucking it beneath his shirt during performances so that it rested against his chest, against the skin where the heartbeat was most clearly felt from the inside. He told a journalist, in one of the few interviews where the subject arose at all, that he did not believe in its protective properties in any literal sense, but that he found the ritual of touching it before going on stage to be a useful form of centering, a brief moment of contact with something that connected him to the version of himself that existed before the diagnosis, before the treatment, before the long, gray years when music had become something he did despite his body, rather than because of it. The amulet was not found on his body after the final concert of the 2014 tour. This detail has been noted by fans who were present at the venue and who observed Martin closely as he left the stage for the last time, and it has been interpreted in ways that range from the mundane to the extravagant, from the simple explanation that he removed it before leaving to various more elaborate theories about what the absence of the amulet might signify about his state of mind at the precise moment when the performance ended. The guitarist who had been in the corridor in Munich was present that night in 2014. He did not approach Martin after the show. He watched from the wings as Martin stood alone on the empty stage for approximately 4 minutes, looking at the instrument in his hands, as though trying to memorize its exact weight. Then Martin looked up, looked directly at the guitarist, and smiled. The guitarist has described that smile as the most unsettling thing he has ever witnessed in 40 years of playing music alongside other people. What did the smile mean? The liver function tests that Martin underwent at the beginning of each new phase of his treatment followed a predictable arc in the early years, and then, gradually, an unpredictable one as the decades accumulated and the organ adapted to its compromised state with a stubbornness that the medical literature calls compensated cirrhosis, and that Martin, in his more darkly humorous moments, referred to as the liver that simply refused to cooperate with its own decline. The fibrosis was real. The scarring of the tissue was visible on the imaging studies that he eventually agreed to share with a close friend who had been pressing him for years to be more transparent about his medical situation. The friend, who had no medical training but who had spent a considerable amount of time reading everything available about the long-term prognosis of chronic hepatitis C infection, understood enough to know that compensated cirrhosis was not the same as stability, that it was more accurately described as a temporary reprieve, a period of apparent function that could persist for years or could collapse within months depending on factors that even the specialists could not fully predict. Martin knew this too. He had read the same literature. He had asked the Auckland gastroenterologist the same uncomfortable questions that any patient with his condition eventually learns to ask, and he had received the same honest, measured answers that left him neither reassured nor despairing, but simply more fully informed about the specific terms of his uncertainty. The liver that refused to fail was still inside him during the recording of the 2014 album. It was still inside him during the final tour. It was inside him in the cafe in Wellington when the woman who had loved him decades earlier described the night he had refused a doctor with a fury that she had never seen him display before or since. The liver that refused to fail was, in a sense, the most reliable thing in his life. Present, functional, stubbornly refusing to be the ending that the medical literature said it should eventually become. Was this refusal a form of rebellion? Or was it simply biology doing what biology sometimes does, persisting beyond the expectations of everyone, including the specialists who had been watching it for 30 years? The inner circle, which is how the people who were closest to Martin during the most difficult years referred to themselves in private conversations that have since become part of the documented history of the chills, operated according to an unspoken agreement that its members would never speak publicly about what they had witnessed. The agreement was not imposed by Martin. It was offered by them, volunteered in the way that people volunteer for service, out of a sense of loyalty or protectiveness, or perhaps simply out of a shared understanding that some narratives are more bearable when they remain within the group that helped produce them. The guitarist honored the agreement. The bassist, who had been with the band during the Submarine Bells era, honored it. The manager, who had held the operation together through 3 lineup changes and 2 near dissolutions and 1 extended hiatus that everyone treated as temporary, honored it. And Martin, who had never asked for the silence, benefited from it in ways that he acknowledged with gratitude, and also with something that sounded, in the interviews where he occasionally touched on the subject, like an undercurrent of regret. He was grateful that his privacy had been protected. He was also aware that the protection had come at a cost that he had not always been in a position to fully appreciate from the inside. The cost of isolation, of carrying things alone when there were people around him who would have been willing to share the weight if they had been explicitly invited to do so. The agreement had been an act of love. It had also been, in ways that none of them had fully confronted, an act of distance, a way of honoring him by refusing to fully know him. Did he want to be fully known, or did he prefer the dignified privacy that the silence afforded him? The question of legacy that Martin answered in that Auckland interview, the one where he said the songs would outlast whatever was happening in his body, continued to reverberate through every subsequent conversation he had with journalists and fans and the occasional academic who approached his work as if it were a subject worthy of formal study. He returned to the theme often, refining the answer with each iteration, but the core of it remained constant. The work was the thing that mattered, and the work would outlast the body that had produced it. What he did not say, what he kept beneath the surface of every measured public statement, was that the relationship between the work and the body was not as clean as the narrative suggested. The hepatitis C had not merely accompanied his career, it had shaped it. The songs he wrote during the worst years of the illness were different from the songs he wrote before, and anyone who listened to the full arc of the recordings could hear the difference if they were willing to listen with the kind of attention that the music deserved. The earlier work was bright and searching and suffused with a quality that sounded like genuine curiosity about the world. The later work was deeper, more interior, more concerned with the texture of time and the weight of memory, and the specific quality of light that exists in rooms where someone is waiting to die. Martin knew this. He had listened to the recordings the way only he could, tracking the progression of his own voice and the evolution of his melodic instincts. And he understood that the illness had not merely damaged him. It had altered him in ways that were, from a purely artistic standpoint, not entirely without value. This did not make the illness welcome. It did not make the suffering acceptable. But it complicated the relationship between cause and effect in a way that resisted the simple narrative of tragedy followed by transcendence that audiences so often wanted to receive. The songs were better because he had been damaged. The songs were more honest. And this fact, which he held privately and shared with no one, was one of the most difficult truths he ever had to carry. What would you do if you discovered that your greatest suffering had also been your greatest teacher? But what also get it on the great founder? The gastroenterologist in Auckland had written something in his clinical notes that Martin was not meant to read. A single line in a file that was later transferred to a digital system and then quietly archived when the clinic changed ownership in the early 2000s. The line read, "Patient demonstrates unusual psychosocial resilience, but underlying hepatic reserve may decompensate faster than laboratory values suggest." The phrase sat in that file for years, untouched, unread by anyone except the specialist who had written it and perhaps one administrative assistant who processed the transfer. It captured, in the detached language of clinical observation, something that Martin had been living from the inside for 2 decades. The gap between what the tests showed and what the body knew was happening beneath the surface. The blood work looked manageable. The enzymes hovered within ranges that could be explained by any number of benign causes. But the specialist had seen enough patients with chronic viral hepatitis to understand that numbers were not destiny, that the liver was an organ of extraordinary camouflage, capable of functioning with a smile while its infrastructure quietly crumbled. He had told Martin, during that measured conversation in the Edwardian Terrace on the street of legal offices, that he should think of his liver not as a fixed asset, but as a depleting resource, a reservoir that would eventually require careful management, even under the best possible circumstances. Martin had nodded during that explanation. He had absorbed it. And then he had walked back out through the side entrance into the narrow lane where the afternoon light fell at an angle that made everything look slightly older than it was. And he had carried the information with him like a second heartbeat, present, but not always audible. What the clinical notes failed to capture was the way Martin had looked when the doctor explained the compensated cirrhosis finding, the particular quality of stillness in his face that was not calm, but something closer to the stillness of a person who has just heard a sound from a great distance and is trying to determine whether it was thunder or a door slamming. The specialist watched him leave through the side entrance and noted, in addendum to the file that was not transferred to the digital system, that the patient appeared to be integrating the information with notable composure, but that the emotional processing would likely occur later, in private, and at a depth that no clinical observation could reliably access. He was right. Martin spent the train journey back to Dunedin staring at the coastline without seeing it, and he did not touch his guitar for 11 days. The cassette that Sarah discovered in the communal storage area did not remain her secret for long, because secrets in dense urban living have a way of finding their natural audience through channels that resist deliberate control. She made a copy for a friend in Christchurch, who made a copy for someone she knew in Wellington, who made a copy for a music blogger who had been documenting the history of the New Zealand underground since the early days of the internet. And within 18 months, the recording had traveled through a network that bore no resemblance to the formal distribution channels that Martin's music had always relied upon. The blogger, who maintained a site that was read by perhaps 3,000 people on a good month, posted the cassette with a brief introduction that called it a document of quiet devastation, and the phrase spread through the forums and social channels of the Chills fandom with a speed that surprised everyone who observed it. Martin learned of the posting from a fan who emailed his management company, expecting the message to be forwarded, expecting some form of official response that would either acknowledge the recording or deny its authenticity. Instead, the management company forwarded the fan's message to Martin with a brief note that said only, "Thoughts?" The brevity of the note contained within it the entire philosophy of the relationship between Martin and the people who had chosen to work with him over the years. They did not decide for him. They did not manage the narrative. They asked what he wanted, and then they did that. Martin read the message on a Sunday morning in his apartment in Dunedin, with the curtains still drawn and the sound of the street filtered to a murmur, and he sat with the information for 3 days before he replied. His reply, which was addressed to the management company rather than to the blogger or the fan, consisted of a single sentence. "I had forgotten that recording existed." The statement was both true and incomplete, and Martin was aware of its incompleteness in the way that he was aware of most things that touched on the years he preferred to leave unexamined. He had not forgotten. He had chosen not to remember, and the distinction mattered in ways that he was not yet prepared to explain to anyone, including himself. The cassette circulated. Listeners who had followed his work for decades described the experience of hearing it as akin to being admitted into a private room that had always existed in the architecture of the music, but had always been locked. The voice on the recording was unguarded in a way that the studio albums had never permitted, reaching for sounds that seemed to exist just beyond the edge of what the arrangements could contain. And the moment where Martin said, "I am not the person who made those earlier songs," was replayed and quoted and debated with an intensity that suggested the sentence had touched something in the audience that went beyond ordinary musical appreciation. What did the world do with testimony that was never meant for the world? The guitarist who had been in the corridor in Munich and who had watched from the wings in 2014 carried a version of events that he had never shared with anyone outside the inner circle. A version that contradicted the accepted narrative of Martin's final years in ways that were difficult to articulate without simultaneously dismantling the comfortable framework that fans and critics had constructed around the story of quiet resilience and hard-won peace. He had sat with Martin in the green room after the Christchurch show, the one from the photograph, and he had listened to Martin say the performance was a disaster. And he had said nothing in response, because he understood, with a clarity that arrived without deliberation, that Martin's assessment was not really about the performance at all. It was about something older, something that the music had accidentally touched in a way that the music was not supposed to touch. A nerve that ran all the way back to the diagnosis and the silence and the years of careful management of a body that had become, in the most literal sense, an instrument of its own undoing. The guitarist had played alongside Martin for a total of 11 years across 3 different periods of the band's existence, and he had come to understand the man in ways that were not always comfortable to acknowledge, ways that involved knowing when to speak and when to sit in a room and allow the silence to do work that words would only interrupt. He knew, for instance, that Martin had kept a second phone, a cheap prepaid device that he used only for calls to the Auckland clinic, and that the existence of this phone was not hidden so much as simply unmentioned, a fact that everyone around Martin had agreed to treat as if it were not a fact at all. He knew that Martin had, on at least 2 occasions during the years of active antiviral treatment, come to rehearsal in a state of physical impairment so pronounced that the other musicians had rearranged their own parts to cover for his inability to play with his usual precision, and that no one had ever acknowledged the rearrangement afterward, as though the adjusted performance had always been the intended version. He knew that the woman in Wellington, the one who had finally agreed to speak publicly after 25 years of silence, had contacted Martin before she gave that interview, and that Martin had declined to meet with her, but had agreed to a phone call, and that the phone call had lasted for 2 hours, and had ended with Martin saying something that the guitarist only learned about secondhand, and that he had promised never to repeat. What he knew about the smile in 2014 was simpler and more devastating than anything the fans had imagined. Martin had smiled because he was relieved. He was relieved that it was over. Not the concert, Not the tour, the performance of being well. The continuous, exhausting labor of appearing healthy enough to justify continuing, strong enough to justify the space he occupied in the lives of people who loved him, composed enough to justify the narrative of resilience that had become, over the decades, the only story that anyone was willing to hear. The smile was the first genuine expression of feeling that the guitarist had seen on Martin's face in 3 years of working together, and it was the expression of a man who had finally been released from the obligation of pretending. Did the guitarist understand that the smile was not about music at all? The records from the Auckland gastroenterologist's practice were not destroyed when the clinic changed ownership in the early 2000s, because medical records in New Zealand are subject to retention requirements that supersede the preferences of individual practitioners and institutional transitions. They were transferred to a regional health archive, where they sat in climate-controlled storage for a period during which the landscape of hepatitis C treatment was transformed by the development of direct-acting antiviral medications that rendered the older clinical protocols obsolete and the older diagnostic categories merely historical. The records were eventually digitized as part of a broader archival project, and a researcher who was working on a history of blood-borne disease in New Zealand requested access to them as part of a batch submission that included files from 7 other specialist practices. The request was approved through the standard channels, and the researcher spent 3 days reviewing files that were organized by patient number rather than by name, in compliance with privacy regulations that had been strengthened in the years since the original consultations had taken place. Patient number, in Martin's case, was associated with a set of documents that ran to 47 pages, a clinical history that traced the progression of a viral infection across 3 decades with the dispassionate precision of a tide chart. The researcher, who had no personal connection to Martin's music and who approached the file as a document of medical history rather than as a window into the life of a public figure, noted that the patient demonstrated a pattern of delayed presentation that was not uncommon in cases of acquisition during the peak era of needle sharing, a pattern in which the diagnosis arrived years or even decades after the initial infection, and often as a result of circumstances unrelated to the infection itself. In Martin's case, the file showed that the diagnosis had followed a routine blood panel ordered during a period of unexplained fatigue, a clinical irony so perfect it seemed almost scripted. The virus that had been silently colonizing his liver for years was finally discovered not because anyone suspected it, but because he had gone to a doctor complaining of being tired. The researcher wrote a footnote about this detail in the draft of the history, describing it as an example of the way chronic viral infections often announce themselves through symptoms that patients and clinicians alike tend to normalize as the ordinary weight of contemporary existence. The footnote did not mention Martin's name, but it described a patient whose clinical course was unusual in one specific respect. The rate of fibrosis progression was measurably slower than the models predicted, a fact that the treating gastroenterologist had noted in the file with what the researcher interpreted as a note of cautious clinical surprise. The liver was doing something that the literature suggested it should not be capable of doing. What did it mean that the body could refuse its own decline? The inner circle's pact of silence had always contained within it a structural tension that its members had recognized in theory, but had never fully confronted in practice. A tension between the desire to protect Martin and the knowledge that protection, when it takes the form of concealment, can become its own kind of abandonment. The bassist, who had been with the band during the Submarine Bells era, and who had maintained a relationship with Martin that survived lineup changes and geographical separations, and the particular strain that chronic illness places on every relationship it touches, had raised the subject once, during a conversation that took place in a restaurant in Dunedin over a meal that neither of them was particularly interested in eating. She had said that she sometimes wondered whether they had done him a kindness or a disservice by agreeing never to speak publicly about what they had seen. And she had said it with a directness that was unusual for her, because the bassist was generally a person who preferred to let actions communicate what words might make too explicit. Martin had been quiet for a long time before he answered, and when he did answer, he had said something that she would later describe to a friend as the most Martin thing he had ever said. He told her that the silence had not been imposed, and that he had benefited from it in ways that he was not certain he deserved to benefit from, and that the question of whether the pact had been right or wrong was ultimately less interesting to him than the question of whether the people who made it had done so out of love or out of discomfort with the kind of attention that honesty would have attracted. The question had landed between them like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples had spread outward through the subsequent years in ways that neither of them could have fully predicted. The bassist had chosen to interpret the question as an act of grace rather than as an accusation, as evidence that Martin still trusted her enough to think out loud in her presence, and she had honored that trust by not attempting to answer it directly, by allowing the silence that followed to be a silence of shared uncertainty rather than a silence of avoidance. They had continued to see each other after that conversation. They had continued to make music together, in the irregular and improvised way that had come to define their collaboration in the later years, and the music that emerged from those sessions was different from anything they had made before, colored by a shared understanding that had survived the worst years and had arrived at something that neither of them had a precise name for, but that both of them recognized as valuable. Was the pact of silence a failure of courage, or was it the only form of courage that the situation permitted? The woman in Wellington, the one who had waited 25 years before speaking publicly about her relationship with Martin during the Submarine Belles era, had been contacted by a documentary filmmaker in the mid-2000s, an approach that she initially declined before reconsidering after a conversation that lasted several hours over the course of 2 days. The filmmaker, who had approached the project with an integrity that she had not expected to find in someone working in a medium that she associated with simplification and sensationalism, had explained that the film would not be complete without her testimony, and that the omission of her perspective would leave a gap in the historical record that could not be filled by any other source. She had weighed this argument against the promise she had made to herself years earlier, a promise that had grown more rather than less important to her as the decades accumulated. The promise to protect Martin from the exposure that testimony of the kind she possessed would inevitably generate. In the end, she had made her choice based on a calculation that she described to the filmmaker with a clarity that suggested she had been performing this particular arithmetic for years, turning the numbers over in private, testing the weight of competing obligations against each other in the small hours of the morning when sleep would not come. She decided that Martin had earned the right to be remembered fully, including in the dimensions that he himself had tried to keep hidden, and that her obligation to his memory outweighed her obligation to his privacy. The interview was filmed in a single afternoon in the same cafe in Wellington where she had given the original testimony that had been cited in the handoff documentation, and the filmmaker captured on camera the precise moment when she described the night Martin arrived at her flat, shaking and refusing medical help. A moment when her composure, which had been carefully maintained throughout the hours of conversation, briefly fractured in a way that was visible and real, and that the camera recorded with the indifferent precision of the machine that does not know the difference between acting and truth. She had said the word exhaustion twice during the interview, in different contexts, and she had looked out the window at the harbor during the second instance, and the light on the water was the color of late autumn, in a city that she had chosen to live in because it was far enough from Dunedin that she could maintain the particular distance from Martin's story that she required in order to continue living her own. Did she believe, in the end, that the telling had been an act of love or an act of closure? The financial records that survived Martin's years of greatest productivity tell a story that contradicts the mythology in ways that are difficult to reconcile with the image of a musician who was, by the accounts of everyone who knew him, constitutionally incapable of thinking about money. The royalty statements from the peak Submarine Belles era show figures that should have translated into security, into property, into the kind of foundation that allows an artist to weather the decades of variable income that characterize every musician's life after their commercial peak. But the bank records that were eventually reviewed by an accountant hired by Martin's estate after his passing tell a different story, one in which the income arrived and departed with a speed that left almost nothing behind, absorbed by a combination of medical expenses that were never fully disclosed to anyone outside the inner circle, touring costs that exceeded the revenue they generated, and a pattern of financial generosity toward band members and friends that the accountant described in his professionally neutral language as externally unsustainable. The guitarist who had witnessed the corridor scene in Munich learned only after Martin's death that there had been a period during the early years of the antiviral treatments when Martin had been unable to meet the co-payment requirements for one of the newer medications, a gap that he had covered not by reducing his living expenses, but by selling a sequence of possessions that his younger self would have considered irreplaceable. A vintage guitar acquired during the peak years, a collection of records that had been assembled over 2 decades of obsessive crate digging in cities around the world, and a set of handwritten lyrics from the Submarine Bells sessions that a music archive in Wellington had offered to purchase for a sum that would have covered 6 months of treatment. He had sold all of it without mentioning the sale to anyone in the inner circle. The guitarist learned this from the bassist, who had learned it from the manager, who had discovered it only because the estate review required a complete accounting of every asset that Martin had ever owned, including the ones he had quietly surrendered during the years when the cost of staying alive exceeded the income from making music. Did the people who loved him know how close he had come, more than once, to the kind of financial catastrophe that would have required him to choose between treatment and survival? The makeup artist who worked with the Chills during a particularly grueling stretch of the 2008 European tour had agreed to speak about her experiences only on the condition that the interview would not be published until she had first read and approved every word of the transcript, a precaution that she explained by saying she had spent too many years watching people in the music industry use other people's words to build narratives that served purposes the original speakers had never intended to serve. She was a woman in her 50s who had been working in the entertainment industry since her early 20s, and she had developed, over the decades, a professional philosophy that she described as systematic skepticism, a framework for engaging with the emotional realities of her clients that allowed her to be present without being consumed, effective without being exploited. She had encountered Martin during a period when his health had stabilized enough to allow touring, but when the visible signs of the underlying condition were still apparent to anyone whose job it was to compensate for them. She described the process of preparing his face for stage lighting that was unforgiving in its exposure of every shadow and hollow, a process that required daily negotiation with the reality of a man whose skin had taken on a particular quality that she associated with long-term illness, a sallowness that no amount of foundation could fully neutralize, but that could be managed sufficiently to prevent the audience from seeing what lay beneath the performance. She told the interviewer that Martin had been, in her professional experience, one of the least demanding clients she had ever worked with, a man who submitted to the rituals of preparation with a patience that she initially mistook for indifference before she understood that it was something closer to resignation, an acceptance that the performance of health required procedures that were tedious and sometimes uncomfortable, but that were necessary if the audience was to receive what they had paid for. She remembered one evening in particular, a show in Hamburg where the venue's backstage area was inadequately heated, and Martin had been shivering in his chair between the makeup application and the stage call, and she had placed a small space heater near his chair without being asked, and he had looked at her with an expression that she described as gratitude, but that she amended, upon reflection, to describe as something more complicated. The gratitude of a person who had grown unaccustomed to small kindnesses, precisely because they had spent so many years navigating a world in which kindness was always conditional, always transactional, always carrying an implicit expectation of return. She worked with him for 3 more tours after Hamburg. She never asked him about his health. She understood, from the first week of working with him, that there were questions that were not questions, that there were silences that carried more meaning than any words could convey, and that the most useful thing she could do as a professional was to perform her work with precision and discretion, and to allow the man beneath the makeup to remain, if he chose to, in the privacy that he had earned. What did she see that she chose not to document in her professional notes? The contract that Martin's management company had maintained since the earliest days of the Chills contained a clause that was never invoked, never discussed in interviews, and never acknowledged in any public document related to the band's history. A clause that had been inserted by a lawyer whose name appeared in the header of the original agreement, alongside a series of abbreviations that suggested memberships in professional associations that were standard for entertainment attorneys of that era. The clause addressed the scenario in which Martin became physically incapable of performing, and it specified a sequence of financial provisions that were designed to ensure the band's survival as an entity capable of generating revenue, even in the absence of its primary creative force. The revenue was not insignificant. The Chills catalog had been licensed for use in films, in commercials, in compilation albums that appeared with regularity in the digital marketplace, and the royalties from these licenses flowed to an entity that was owned in majority by Martin, but that allocated percentage points to the other members of the band according to a formula that had been negotiated during the Submarine Bells era and that had been adjusted several times since then as the relative contributions of individual members shifted with the changes in the lineup. The existence of this clause meant that Martin had, at some point during his most creatively productive period, confronted the possibility of his own incapacity and had made provision for it in a document that was designed to survive him, to continue functioning as a financial mechanism, even if the body that had created the music was no longer present to participate in its reception. The lawyer who drafted the clause had since retired from practice, and when contacted by a researcher who was working on a comprehensive history of the New Zealand independent music scene, he declined to discuss the specific provisions of the contract on the grounds of client confidentiality that he maintained regardless of the client's living or deceased status. But he confirmed, in a brief phone conversation, that the clause existed and that it had been included at Martin's explicit request, a detail that contradicted the prevailing narrative of Martin as a man who refused to think about his own mortality with any sustained practical attention. The contract itself was held in a safe deposit box in Dunedin that required Martin's physical presence to access, and the manager who held the secondary key had never used it, had never been asked to use it, and had maintained the key in a drawer in his office for 3 decades without knowing whether the contents of the box had ever been reviewed by anyone other than Martin himself. What provisions had Martin made for a future he did not expect to see? The final years of Martin's life unfolded with a quality that those who observed them from the outside found difficult to characterize in simple terms, a quality that resisted the narrative frameworks that observers typically apply to the closing chapters of a creative artist's biography. He was not at peace in the way that the final album seemed to promise, nor was he consumed by the despair that the more melodramatic interpretations of his health struggles would have suggested. He was something more ambiguous and more human than either of those characterizations allowed. A man who had arrived at a particular relationship with his own mortality through decades of negotiation with it, and who inhabited that relationship with a complexity that was apparent to everyone who spent time with him during these years. He continued to write music, though less frequently and with longer intervals between the bursts of productivity that had characterized his younger self. He continued to perform, though the performances were rarer and more carefully selected, chosen for reasons that had as much to do with the specific venue and audience as with any commercial calculation. He continued to speak about his health when asked, with the same measured directness that had always distinguished his public statements from the deflections and evasions that were standard among musicians discussing their vulnerabilities. And he did so with a quality that his closest friends described as simultaneously more relaxed and more precise than his earlier interviews, as though the passage of time had given him both the distance required to examine his experience with analytical clarity and the emotional security required to share that examination without fear of being misunderstood. The amulet, the small stone in tarnished silver that he had worn against his chest for decades, had reappeared during this period. The guitarist, who had witnessed the smile in 2014, noticed it hanging from Martin's neck during a rehearsal session in 2017, and he said nothing about it. But he understood the reappearance to mean something that he could not have articulated if asked. Something about the relationship between the object and the person who wore it. About the way that symbols can change their meaning as the person who carries them moves through different phases of their relationship with themselves. Martin touched the stone during the rehearsal in the same unconscious way he always had. A brief contact with the fingertips before playing a difficult passage. And the guitarist watched the gesture and understood it as a form of communication that was not directed at anyone present. A private ritual that had survived the decades and the illnesses and the silences and the performances, and had arrived, somehow, in the rehearsal room of a converted warehouse in Dunedin as something that was still functional, still necessary, still capable of doing whatever it was that Martin needed it to do. What did the amulet know that the doctors did not? The memorial concert that was organized in Dunedin after Martin's passing drew an audience that exceeded the expectations of everyone who had participated in the planning. A crowd that filled the venue and spilled out into the street and stood in the rain listening to the sound system that had been set up to broadcast the performances to those who could not get inside. The lineup included musicians who had played with Martin at various points in his career, friends who had never performed publicly with him, but who had been invited to participate because of the role they had played in his life, and a series of artists from the contemporary New Zealand scene who had been influenced by his work and who wanted to honor that influence in the only language they fully trusted, the language of music. The guitarist, who had been in the corridor in Munich, stood at the center of the stage for the final set, surrounded by musicians who had brought their instruments and their memories, and their willingness to navigate an evening that was both celebration and mourning, and something that occupied the uncertain territory between the two. He spoke briefly before the last song, and what he said was simple and unadorned, and contained none of the biographical summary that such occasions typically demand. And he finished by quoting something that Martin had said to him during a conversation that had taken place in the green room after a show in Christchurch years earlier. A show that had nothing remarkable about it except that it had happened, that they had both been present for it, and that Martin had chosen that ordinary evening to say something that the guitarist had carried with him ever since, and that he now offered to the audience as the only summary of Martin Phillipps that he considered accurate. Martin had said, "I was never trying to be great. I was trying to be honest." The guitarist paused after speaking the words, and the audience was quiet. And then the bassist stepped to the microphone and played the opening chord of Pink Frost, and the evening continued. Did the music say what the words could not? The estate that Martin left behind was modest by the standards of musicians who had achieved even a fraction of his critical recognition, and the distribution of its assets followed instructions that he had drafted during a period of particular clarity about his own mortality. Instructions that allocated the majority of the financial residue to a charitable trust dedicated to supporting musicians living with chronic illness, and that left smaller bequests to the individuals who had maintained their loyalty to him through the decades of difficulty and uncertainty and silence. The provision for the trust was the clause that the lawyer had drafted decades earlier, the one that had been designed to survive Martin and to continue functioning as a financial mechanism, and its activation after his death was the fulfillment of a provision that he had insisted upon including in the original agreement, even though no one involved in the negotiation at the time could have imagined the specific form that the trust would eventually take. The inner circle received their bequests with a complexity of feeling that none of them discussed publicly, a mixture of gratitude and grief, and something that might have been recognition. The acknowledgement that they had been part of something that had mattered beyond the music, that the silences they had maintained and the loyalties they had honored had been worth the cost that they had incurred in the currency of not knowing. The guitarist received a letter from the estate that contained no legal language, no description of the bequest, only a brief note in Martin's handwriting that had been prepared years earlier and that had been waiting in the drawer of a desk in Dunedin for the moment when it would be needed. The note said, "Thank you for not asking." The guitarist read the note alone in his apartment in the same city where the corridor scene had taken place decades earlier, and he understood for the first time that the silence had been mutual, that it had been a form of communication that only worked if both parties honored it, and that Martin had recognized and valued the choice that the guitarist had made on that night in Munich, when he had closed the door instead of calling for help. The choice had been Martin's as much as it had been the guitarist's. The silence had been shared. The trust that had grown from it had survived everything. Did Martin understand, in the end, that the people who kept his secrets were not abandoning him, but loving him in the only way they knew how? The documentary that the filmmaker from Wellington had assembled from the testimony of the inner circle and the woman who had waited 25 years to speak reached its final cut after 18 months of editing and review, and its reception in New Zealand and internationally confirmed what the filmmaker had believed from the beginning: that the story of Martin Phillipps was not a niche interest, but a universal one. That the themes of illness and silence and artistic identity and the performance of wellness resonated with audiences who had no connection to the Chills and no familiarity with the history of the New Zealand underground scene. The film was not a tragedy in the conventional sense. It was something more difficult and more useful, a portrait of a man navigating an existence that had been complicated by a single careless moment and by the decades of consequences that followed from it. And it found in that navigation something that audiences recognized as their own: a universal struggle to remain themselves when the conditions of their existence had been altered by forces beyond their control. The final scene of the film showed Martin sitting in his apartment in Dunedin in the late afternoon light that fell through the half-obscured windows, and he was not speaking to the camera, but simply sitting, with a guitar resting across his knees, and his hands were still, and his face held an expression that the filmmaker described in the director's statement as the most honest expression of peace that she had ever witnessed in another human being. The camera held on his face for a long time. Then the screen went dark. Then the credits ran. The film won 3 awards at the New Zealand Film Festival that year, and it was screened at venues around the world to audiences who had come expecting to learn about a musician and who left having learned something about the nature of suffering and the possibility of grace. What do we owe the people who teach us how to survive? The last recording that Martin made, a piece that he completed in the final weeks of his life and that he chose not to release or share with anyone during his lifetime, was found on a digital device in his apartment after his passing. And it was a single track that lasted just under 7 minutes and that contained none of the layered instrumentation or studio polish that had characterized his professional work. It was a voice and a guitar, recorded on equipment that suggested he had not been trying to create a document, but simply to capture something that was passing through him in real time. And the voice was quieter than any voice he had ever used on a professional recording, and the guitar playing was spare and searching, and occasionally uncertain, in a way that suggested he was following the music rather than directing it. The track had no title in the file metadata. It was simply labeled in Martin's own handwriting on a piece of paper that had been tucked beside the device. For whoever finds this. The bassist was the first member of the inner circle to hear it, and she listened alone in her apartment in Wellington, with the same autumn light falling through her windows that had been falling through Martin's windows in Dunedin on the day he recorded it. And when the track finished, she sat for a long time without moving. And then she wrote an email to the other members of the inner circle that contained only 4 words. He found the peace. The track was released, eventually, as a digital bonus with the reissue of the final album, and listeners who heard it described the experience in terms that the bassist recognized because they matched her own. The feeling of being admitted into a room that had always been locked. The feeling of hearing a voice that was finally completely unguarded. The feeling of understanding something about the relationship between suffering and beauty that had been present in all of Martin's work, but that had never been stated so plainly as it was stated in those 7 minutes of voice and guitar. The last thing he made was the most honest thing he ever made, and he gave it away. What would you give to be remembered? Friends, what do you think when you hear Martin's story tonight? Do you see him as a victim of the system and the silence that surrounded him? Or do you believe he was complicit in his own fate by choosing concealment over confession when it mattered most? Did the people around him fail him by respecting his privacy? Or did they love him exactly as he needed to be loved? Write your thoughts in the comments below. We need to know whether the world still remembers Martin Phillipps, whether the music found you, whether pink frost still means something to you in a city far from Dunedin. Hit like for the truth and subscribe to see more stories of the ones we lost too soon.